So we're going to jump ahead to flop play. Again, we're going to assume we're readless, so our goal remains the same. Get a feel for our opponent's tendencies. And what do I mean by that? I'm going to try to figure out the board textures the villain check raises on, what board textures he completely gives up on. I'm going to figure out if he donk bets. When he check raises, what cards does he barrel on the turn? More importantly, does this villain seem like he wants to play a big pot? I love those guys because they usually make the biggest mistakes. All these questions and more are crucial to ask yourself on the flop, as pre-flop and flop play are the main parts where you build your game plan. You are in control. Based on the decisions you make on these two streets, you should be able to dictate how big a pot you want to play on the turn in the river. Now let's take a look at the differences of board textures when deep. First, the dry flop. Typically readless, I consider these flops one and done. I'm looking to get a feel for the villain still, and I have no idea how wide he is willing to call me down. If he always gives up when he misses, you should figure that out relatively quickly, as he'll fold to your c-bets over 70% of the time. If he is calling very frequently, he is likely peeling with some hands he shouldn't be. I like to mix in a two-barrel with some kind of equity versus this type of villain during the first level to see if he's willing to fold that weaker range. If he calls two barrels while also peeling the flop bets that wide, it's time to adjust. Consider c-betting tighter, and always two-barreling when you c-bet. And also increasing your c-bet and barrel sizes could be a good adjustment. Ideally, you would try just one adjustment at a time. This, of course, would be like following an experiment in the scientific method, only having one variable while keeping the other factors as a control. But in the lovely world of turbos, we may not have the luxury of getting a sample on each adjustment. So I'm probably just going to make all the adjustments at once for a set type of player, and if it's not working the way I'd like it to, I'd start eliminating them. So I kind of work backwards. But again, we have limited time and limited hands in order to get this read. To the right, we have several examples of some dry flops. Some have more potential than others. The King 9-3 flop has the luxury of having a gut shot, so it could be a candidate to try and double barrel on if we have the gut shot, which also includes 2 overs to the 9. The Queen 3-3 flop likely isn't a good flop to try and double barrel versus anybody. Most people would call 2 streets here with ace high, leading us to need to 3-barrel to win. Remember, we're looking for cheap ways to learn about our opponent, and running a 3-barrel early in this spot where the board texture doesn't change much seems like a terrible idea. The ironic thing about these boards is that while some people tend to almost always give up on them, others choose these boards to run their big bluffs. Find out which player you're dealing with and adjust accordingly. If somebody does check raise me in the first few hands on this board, I'm likely to peel extremely wide. If it's 10-20 and we raise to 40, c-bet to 40, and get check raised to 120, it's only 80 to win 240. If we are near the starting stack still, that is an extremely small percentage of our stack. This also forces the villain to follow up his check raise with a turn bet, thus making his price for bluffing much less favorable. Then, even if the villain check raises a strong hand like top pair here, with stacks this deep, he can find himself in some very uncomfortable spots on later streets, depending on the runout. By folding to a check raise early on, you don't learn anything useful. When we do call a check raise in the future, after folding to this initial check raise, we won't have a clue about our villain's turn barrel frequency and can leave us guessing a lot with potentially only a medium strength hand. I'd rather have a completely weak hand when I find out and not have a hard decision. So, alright, so I went a little more in depth than I planned on this topic, considering this is supposed to be about only readless play, and we made a little some adjustments. But I think understanding what you're looking for early on is crucial, and knowing what adjustments to make as you begin to create a villain-specific game plan. Next, we will go to the wet flop. These can be a little more complicated. Since there are so many more hands that hit, villain is more likely to call a flop c-bet. If you're going to bluff, rarely can it be a one-street bluff. On very wet flops, it's often a good idea to not even c-bet a hand with no equity when called. I think that by giving up on a lot of wet flops where you can't improve, it will give your bluffs more credit if you decide to barrel a good run out. The biggest question to figure out while still readless is, does your opponent play your draws aggressively or passively? Also, knowing a villain check raise is a hand like 9x on the 9-6-4 all spades flop below, Or the 8x on the 6, 7, 8 with the two clubs flop can be extremely useful information. People often mistakenly value raise their hand on very, very wet boards, and when the runout goes to hell, they're stuck with a huge stack to pot ratio and no idea where they are at. Those type of villains can make peeling with obscure draws occasionally very profitable. When you hit, nobody thinks of you having it, and it's likely to get paid, and you're also able to bluff the obvious draw that you don't have when it hits. An example of what I mean by that could be, say you have 10-7 offsuit on the 9-6-4 all spades flop, and you get check raised. You call, and if you hit the 8, nobody sees it coming. If a spade comes and they check, a lot of times it looks like you have the flush draw, they check, and you bet an appropriate size for that villain to make them fold. The 8 gets you paid because they don't think you have it, and the spade gets the fold, and it doesn't matter because you didn't have that draw.